talking to you today about cultural heritage issues and how they intersect with lunar and asteroid mining. But just to make something very clear from the start, because many people assume this is what space archaeology means, I'm not interested in aliens. I'm not going to be talking about whether we might dig up an alien artefact if we put an open-cut mine on the moon. I'm also not going to be talking particularly about some of the ethical issues with disturbing these landscapes, even though in some ways they intersect with each other just a little bit. And I'm also not going to be talking about what in the United States is called historic preservation. That's a term that I think limits us in ways that we probably don't need to be, particularly in resource extraction industries. What I am going to talk about is particularly the human material culture that is now spread throughout the solar system, to the very edge of the solar system where the Voyager spacecraft may, even as we speak, be crossing the edge of the solar system. I'm going to be talking a bit about how heritage works in mining, some of the processes that are usual in heritage management, and I am going to be talking about heritage management rather than heritage preservation, because the aim of doing this work isn't always to preserve the heritage asset. It is usually to manage heritage values within a number of different competing interests, and doing that in such a way that, fingers crossed, everybody comes out getting some advantage from it. And I'll raise just a few issues that I think we need to consider when we're thinking about lunar and asteroid mining. At the bottom of that slide, I have a very basic definition of what heritage is. And it basically is just things from the past, and those can be material things, they can be ideas, they can be personal stories, they can be almost anything from the past that people in the present feel has some value and that they would like to see continue into the future. Heritage is very much based around contemporary communities, what they feel strongly about and what they feel attached to. So this is a field that is very well developed on Earth, and in fact Australia is a bit of a world leader in this regard too. We have a number of levels of regulation that affect heritage management. It starts at the international level with things like the World Heritage Convention, which establishes a World Heritage List, and I'm sure everyone is familiar with terrestrial places that are on that list. Most countries in the world have national heritage legislation of different kinds. And within different nation states, there's frequently state-level heritage legislation or regional heritage legislation. In Australia, every single state has usually two sets of legislation, one covering Aboriginal heritage, one covering European historic heritage, with the exception of the ACT and the Northern Territory at the moment. The act that I'm most familiar with working with is the Aboriginal Heritage Act in South Australia, but I also do a lot of work in Western Australia too, so it has separate Aboriginal heritage legislation. One of the reasons why Australia is a leader in this field is because in 1979 a bunch of heritage people got together in the South Australian town of Burra, and they came up with a thing called the Burra Charter, a set of guidelines for managing places of cultural significance. The Burra Charter is applicable to almost anything you can think of. It's very simple, it's very powerful, and it's been adopted by people working in heritage across the world. So places like China and New Zealand actually based their heritage legislation on this charter. So it was developed here in Australia, but it is internationally recognised as a really simple and powerful set of heritage guidelines. So I'll be mentioning it a few times today. And it is one of the things that makes Australians so good at doing this kind of work. Oh, that's not what I want. What do I want? So as a professional cultural heritage manager working in the mining sector myself, this is the kind of thing I would do on a day-to-day, on a year-to-year basis. As said, every state has heritage legislation that covers Aboriginal heritage in some way, and mining companies have to comply with that legislation as part of their social licensing processes. And this is frequently done within the umbrella of environmental impact studies, but sometimes separately as well. So a mining company will engage my company in order to ensure that they comply, that they don't commit an offence under the heritage legislation. We will do a desktop study, perhaps to start with. We'll identify heritage places and heritage values, the stakeholders that need to be consulted. That may or may not lead on to a field survey where we go out and roam about the bush, sometimes with, blasting and various things taking place not so very far away. In that survey we will find places of interest to Aboriginal communities, frequently native title groups. We'll record them fully, assess their cultural significance, and then assess the impacts from the development. And then we will make recommendations to our client. So my company does a lot of work with Rio, FNG, Hancock, a whole bunch of people, particularly in the Burra. We'll make recommendations so that they can avoid committing an offence under the Act. And this isn't always to say this site cannot be disturbed or destroyed. Frequently these decisions are about move this road 100 metres, or can we save this place over here while letting this place go. There's a lot of negotiation, and the idea is that we're managing these places. We're enabling activities to go ahead while also making sure that the heritage values of a particular place are protected as much as they can be. And this kind of work starts from the pre-feasibility phase, and we're involved in all aspects of mining through operation and frequently to the decommissioning and rehabilitation phase. So this is what's normal in Australia for heritage management in the mining industry, and it's kind of the kind of thing that's followed in many other countries as well. But we obviously have a very different situation in space. The first thing is that none of that national or state heritage legislation applies in space. A second factor is the Outer Space Treaty has the clause that says that material in space is owned by the launching state. So that means you could say a place like Tranquility Base on the Moon. The US obviously has an interest in that because they own the actual artefacts. But a heritage site or an archaeological site isn't just those material things, it's also the traces and the footprints and the traverses. It's stuff in the soil and even under the soil as well. So we have in the international norm area a sort of a halfway thing that defines a national interest in human material culture, but actually doesn't help us at all when we're trying to define what a heritage place or a heritage site is. And even if we did have some kind of international agreement or some kind of convention that dealt with heritage in space, we have a fairly limited capacity to enforce that. It's no good saying, don't go and disturb this amazing place, when if anybody who goes to do it basically can suffer no consequences. You may not even know that they've done it. So that makes that sort of legislative heritage regime possibly quite unworkable anyway. Another factor is that there's no life, and this is where I'm going to say I'm not going to even go near whether we might actually find some life on Mars or anything like that. Those are issues for another realm. But there are no humans or animals or ecosystems in space whose survivability or sustainability we have to consider. And this, I have found, means that most people working in the space sector don't really have a very good concept of environment. So the idea of environmental management in a way that isn't about impacts on Earth is really quite poorly developed. And this means taking it that step further to talk about heritage management is a little bit more difficult. And you might well ask, as people frequently do, why should we even care about heritage places and heritage values in space? And it comes back to that definition of heritage. It's people in the present and in the future who might actually have a say or an interest in what's out there and what it might mean for them. And you can imagine, one of the examples I use when I'm talking about the heritage values of orbital debris is the Vanguard 1 satellite, the oldest satellite still in orbit. So you can imagine someone 100 years from now just shaking their head in disbelief, thinking, some bastards back in 2014 decided to just zap that out of the sky because it was space junk. So if you just imagine someone just thinking, you know, what were they doing? Why did they do that? They didn't have to. So it's that kind of thing, those kinds of issues we should really be planning for as well. So thinking about something like mining on the moon, in heritage terms, we have to think who are the stakeholders in that heritage. So not in the resources or the profits or the industry. Who are the stakeholders in that heritage? And that pretty much means every single person on Earth. Every single person on Earth that was ever born has looked up to the sky and seen the moon. The moon is something present in everybody's conception of the world. It's something that is enshrined and celebrated in countless stories and cosmologies and mythologies and legends. Even if it's, you only think you're looking at the rabbit in the moon, or is it the man in the moon, or is it the duck in the moon, everybody has some attachment to the moon. So in terms of lunar mining, those attachments and feelings are something that industry is going to have to manage. Let's just imagine, as that picture shows, that you might actually be able to see lunar mines from the Earth. Imagine what, and I'm not going to try and predict, but I imagine people will have a reaction to that. If every time they look up in the sky, they can see some new scar or shadow or figure on the moon. They may think it's amazing, they may not, but they're going to think something, and that something, that reaction, is something to do with heritage attachments that are going to have to be managed. Something else to consider is, and I'll talk more about lunar heritage sites in a minute, people might be quite interested or think something like Tranquility-based, the first site of landing on the moon, has a tremendous amount of heritage significance. Are they going to feel the same way about a mine? The difference between human material culture and human sites relating to exploration and science and to profit making are likely to have very different reactions from people. So we can't assume that those feelings are going to be transferable or are going to be similar between them. So let's quickly have a look at the stuff that is actually on the moon. There are currently 4 nations that have put material there. Most of it is from the US and the USSR, and obviously the US is the only nation that has had actual people on the moon. So there are sites, there are places where each of these missions crash-landed or soft-landed or put people down. And there are landscapes that are created by those sites. So in heritage terms, the moon is now a cultural landscape. It's not just the little isolated places, it's actually the whole network of places. It's their relationship to each other that makes them into a new entity that has value in its own right, the human landscape of the moon. And interestingly, just recently, 2011, NASA decided that the situation had become critical enough for them to put together a set of heritage guidelines for all these sites on the moon. So they're only guidelines. They're relating particularly to Apollo, Ranger and Surveyor sites, but they give the hint that they could well be adopted by other nations for use with their own heritage, own national heritage on the moon. They're a very interesting read, and in fact it's Christian's boss who was the main author of these guidelines. Among some of the things they recommend is buffer zones around particular sites, so you can only go within a certain distance. There are different things like if you're in some kind of surface vehicle or some kind of flying vehicle, different ways to safely approach these places so that you don't blast dust all over them or land on top of them or get fuel residues on them. And using a lot of the data from Apollo landing sites, they have determined that the major threat to these sites is not so much people deciding to have a little wander up and steal some stuff. The major threat is actually lunar soil, which can have a highly abrasive effect on the equipment, on the surfaces, on the actual dust. So in terms of what this means, we have to think about those guidelines. Basically, they weren't talking about mining, they were just talking about people being on the moon and being in and around these places. But in terms of mining, we can assume, I think, that mining activities will create more dust than someone just sending down a little landing module. They will have to have a bigger impact than purely scientific and exploration activities. But the whole point about these sites is if you go near them, you basically destroy them. You destroy those surfaces. You create dust. You create impacts on these sites. So apart from remotely, we can't really go there to do the other thing a heritage person would do, to fully record them and then to assess their condition. So we kind of don't even really have a baseline to measure what the impacts of mining will be on these sites. So if we go there to have a look, we actually create the impact that we're so keen to avoid. On the good side though, if the arguments set forth in those heritage guidelines are correct and dust is going to be, dust and particles and all that stuff is going to be the major source of impact on these heritage sites, then if lunar mining solves their own dust problems, manages and mitigates the impacts of dust for themselves, that may actually also have a beneficial effect on these heritage sites. So we may actually be able to solve two problems at once. The problems that lunar mining needs to solve may also be the same ones that will minimise and mitigate that impact on the heritage sites. So going right through to the end of the mine site, let's just say you've got all of that resource out that you could possibly get and you're proposing to not operate that particular mining location anymore. On Earth, we would propose that a mine site is rehabilitated in some way, that it might be returned to some kind of condition that it was in before somebody had cut a great big pit in the ground. And lots of mine sites will want to make some effort to show that there was human activity here. So we're not kind of deceiving people into thinking it's a natural environment insofar as it's natural. And in fact, the mining activity has created a heritage of its own. It's become part of that cultural landscape. So perhaps the best management option is to leave the pit or the pits or the whatever it is, whatever it might look like, which we may not fully understand at this point. Leave it as it is and provide some kind of interpretation for possible future visitors. So acknowledge that it is not something separate from the landscape now, but part of it, and acknowledge that instead of attempting to disguise it. And it will be interesting. I mean, you could imagine that there would be a public perception that it would be irresponsible to do that people would like to see the semblance of a natural environment returned. Again, I've got no idea how people will see it, but people will again have opinions about this, and they will probably be very strong opinions. And in any rehabilitation or management process of these places, consulting public opinion is probably going to be really important. And as for asteroids, because they're not as visible as the Moon, unless we're actually bringing them close into orbit and doing things closer to Earth with them, it'll be interesting to see if people have any kind of strong feelings or reactions about that, about what those values might be and how they might be managed. This is my second to last thought. One of the hot topics at the moment is the idea that we're in a new geological age, that human activities on the Earth have brought us out of the Holocene and into the Anthropocene, where all of our population growth and the creation of structures that will get into the geological record and light and and resources and all of those things, temperature rising, global climate change, all of that stuff has created effectively a new geological epoch in which anthropogenic activities are the primary driver. If we're going to put these kinds of infrastructures out on the Moon, on Mars maybe, on asteroids or in around asteroids, effectively we're taking the Anthropocene into space. We're going to be doing some of the similar things. We're going to be redistributing those chemical and mineral signatures. We're going to be altering the balance of things out in the solar system. And I don't really know what I think this means. I think it means that you have a cultural landscape of a whole orders of magnitude greater than the kinds of things we look at on Earth. And that's just maybe something to consider. We're not simply taking a terrestrial activity and putting it in a different place. We're changing the nature of the solar system. We're making the Anthropocene something that's not just on Earth, but that effectively may be a front that's continually moving forward in the same way that the Voyagers and possibly the Pioneers are taking that front forward as well. So my TRUs are, what would we do in the situation of lunar mining? What kinds of things might we do to effectively manage cultural heritage values? And pretty much I think we would follow what the Burra Charter has showed us works so effectively on Earth. We would do some kind of assessment of what's out there, and people have been working on that for some years now, so we've got a pretty good idea of what is out there. We would assess its significance, not as obvious as you think it might be. We would look at what the impacts are, and we would figure out ways to mitigate those impacts such that we can retain the cultural significance of the sites. We have to acknowledge that the place where these sites are, the setting that they're in, the cultural landscape they're in, is part of that significance. And the nice thing about the Burra Charter, which is the bit that I find that developers and mining engineers tend to like the most, is that one of its core messages is, in managing cultural heritage, that you should do as much as is necessary and as little as possible. So sometimes doing absolutely nothing at all is the best management option. You just have to be doing it for well-grounded reasons. So in some ways, it's relatively simple to do good heritage management in space. But as I always say to my clients on Earth, you have to plan for heritage early. It's no good adding it on as an afterthought. It's something that really has to be built into the whole process from the very beginning. So to finish, I would like to thank Andrew very much for inviting me to speak today. I found it fascinating, and I think I'm quite excited to offer my experience of mining to this company. And I'd also like to acknowledge a couple of my colleagues who had some interesting thoughts when I was discussing this presentation with them. And of course, if somebody wants to send me on a heritage survey to the Moon, I'm absolutely happy to go, but I do need the correct PPE to be supplied. So if anyone has any questions.
Okay, again, coming in on time. First question here.
Donna, I think Donna Lawler, who spoke yesterday, I think mentioned...
I missed her, unfortunately.
Well, one of the things I think I recall correctly her saying was that the national laws of the company, the company's Australian, then the national laws of Australia apply to its activities in space. Does that mean that the Burra Charter would apply to the activities of, say, PHP if they decided to go mining in space, but it wouldn't apply to mining activities of, say, DSR?
Well, it's a charter, it's a set of guidelines, so it's not legally binding in any way. It's the industry standard and for Australian heritage managers, and it is accepted by people across the world as a good standard. In terms of terrestrial legislation, yes, they might apply to activities, but the interesting thing is a colleague of mine, Beth Laura O'Leary, was funded by NASA in 2002, I think, to make an inventory of everything left at Tranquility Base. And after they'd done that project, she thought they ought to suggest that NASA heritage list, or was it at the state level, or it might have been, I can't remember which state anyway. She and her team wrote a letter to NASA and said, right, we've done all this work. Now we'd like to propose that you put the site on one of the US, it might have been the national landmark, federal landmark list. And NASA wrote back saying, yeah, great idea, but that could be interpreted by the international community as tantamount to making a territorial claim in contravention of the treaty. But that was you know, more than 10 years ago now. So, and that site has subsequently been listed, or the objects at that site, because that doesn't contravene the treaty to treat the objects as of heritage or archaeological significance, has been listed on the state heritage registers of California, Florida, I think, New Mexico, and there's a push to get other US states to do that. So there's a conflict between, for some things, national legislation can apply to activities of a nation state. For other things, like heritage, not so obvious that they will work.
This was quite an interesting comment you made about, think about heritage, because I actually felt it already. Somebody I talked to in my office area was very adamant about mining the moon.
Yes.
In a negative sense. Because she knows all those poems about the moon, and she felt deeply about we're going to destroy the moon, and it's going to look, blah, 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 blah. So I think you're absolutely correct, and we need to take it into consideration. So my system of mining is on the ground. There will be no changes on the top. So how do we show that? I think we need to not just talk about mining, but also that we're not going to destroy the moon in the process. Is that what you're saying? How can we do that?
Yeah, it's a matter of managing public perceptions, and I think this is where the off-Earth mining industry needs to have a communication plan. We need to have some PR people who understand and know about space. We need to have strategies to get the information out there and get it out, well, not get it out in a way that assists us, but to have some kind of meaningful dialogue with people where they can actually feel empowered to express their views. And all this, I think, there will be, people will just feel so strongly about so many different things, and there'll be things from my heritage background, there will be things, there are things I think are likely, but there'll be stuff that none of us ever predict. There'll be things people come out with that none of us have ever dreamt of. And it's a matter of, we have to manage that in a way that's appropriate and inclusive, I think.
The problem I see is that you think as earthlings, I call it earthlings. And when we talk mining, the most of the people they see earth, top mining, topsoil mining, not on the ground and anything like that, because they hardly see. So we need to manage.
We need the little eye cinema. We need that little
yes.
and we need to show what it might look like in that. That's what we need.
Yeah.
Yeah. So people can see and experience what it might be like. Yeah. Totally.
Okay, question here. Someone? Okay, Craig.
On that point, I just wondering, is there anything, at the risk of putting my foot in my mouth, is there anything to be learned from Antarctica?
In terms of treaties and all that kind of stuff.
I mean,
yes, there's a huge amount.
But sort of mining in Antarctica is a bit of a no-no, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's anything to be learned from that.
Yes, no, I think you're right. It's the perfect analogy in so many ways. And people equally. What's interesting about Antarctica is that so few people have been there. And there's been some really interesting studies on how people perceive value at a distance. And in fact, some of those studies almost show an inverse relationship. So people who are used to something or live there or whatever might place a low value on certain things. But people who live a far distance away, they might not have ever been there, they might never be able to go there, but they value the fact that it exists. And there's been a lot of interesting work done on that kind of thing, and I think you're absolutely right, that is something that we could And there's some amazing heritage sites in Antarctica, you know, all those exploration sites as well. So even and heritage management in extreme environments too, like there's, parallels just sprouting everywhere, really.
One last question from the back. Naomi?
This reminded me of an interview I read with Neil Armstrong when he was asked something along the lines of, do you worry that your footprint will be erased, and what should we do? And he said, I hope that my footprints are erased by many, many footprints of other people soon. And I think that maybe we should be thinking in other ways and not just of global change. And another thing I wanted to say is that just like with the laws of different countries having their own laws and their own interpretations, Australia is very concerned with preserving cultural heritage, but other spacefaring nations who I think are not very concerned with preserving their own environmental culture in their own land, I don't think they would care as much as we do perhaps about heritage of space. And we can't force anyone.
Absolutely, but I think we make a mistake if we assume that most countries in the world don't actually have material culture of their own, either in their own country, if it's even a tracking station or something like that, or stuff in orbit, like there is such diversity in national representation of material culture. And I think you're right in the sense a lot of them probably don't care about it, but if somebody threatens it, that's going to be different. If someone says, we'd just like to zap this out of the sky now because it's a piece of rubbish, that might evoke a response, whatever that response is. And the other point I want to make too is I'm not talking about preservation. I mean, obviously, my personal opinion is these sites are pretty important, but I'm talking about management, and that's not the same thing. It can be a very different thing, and it might involve, exactly as you pointed out, it might involve saying people will feel more strongly about the ability to go to that place than they will about the footprint surviving. And this is why heritage is about what people want. Well, not just what people want, but heritage is about community esteem. So if we as a space community felt strongly about that site in a certain way, it doesn't necessarily mean that different communities in the public will feel the same way. And this is why having meaningful consultation is so important. And as somebody who works with Aboriginal communities, that's certainly something I've seen mining companies do extraordinarily badly over the years. So that's another place where Australia has particular lessons to impart. Because, yes, mining companies can do that stuff really badly, but there's a lot of companies in Australia who are committed to Aboriginal interests, to working well with Aboriginal people, and we have some great precedents for that kind of consultation.
All of them, not a lot of.
Sorry.
Okay,
Okay.
Thanks very much, Alice.